I saw another ad online for some free trimmers, and I hate to say it, but the ad required me to contact them to make arrangements for a pickup, which I don't really like. Now, I couldn't pass on 2 free trimmers, but after working on them, I've changed my mind. This style of trimmer is very special, and it takes a very special person to put themselves through this sort of pain to get them working again. What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is this Bolens string trimmer, and the problem is that it doesn't run. So how do I know it doesn't run? Well, they didn't mention it in the ad, but after looking at it, it's pretty obvious that it's missing most of the fuel lines. That means if we want to get this thing working again, we'll need to replace them, and possibly even more. Now, I'm going to try and repair this trimmer, however, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what those other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. Now, when I saw this trimmer, I hesitated to pick it up because I find this trimmer to be more complicated than it needs to be. On this model, the engine is upside down from a conventional trimmer, so the fuel tank is on top of the engine, making the fuel system more complicated, which means you're going to have to do things a little bit differently. The first thing I want to do is make sure the engine isn't stuck and will spin over. I just realized at this point the pull rope has been chewed up a little bit, so more than likely a puppy has been using it as a chew toy. So it looks like the engine is not stuck, and it also feels like it has a decent amount of compression, so I don't think the engine is worn out. Also, if you want to find out if your engine has a clutch on it, just try turning the trimmer head, and if it won't spin freely and springs back like this one, then there's no clutch on the engine. That means if we do get this engine working, the trimmer head will be spinning even at idle. Now that I know the engine isn't stuck, I'm going to spray some fuel into the foam air filter. That way I don't have to take off the rear cover to the engine to get fuel into the CARB's throat. After that, I'll try and start the engine. Luckily, it started and ran for a few seconds, which means that there is more than enough compression for the engine to run and that the ignition system is working as well. If the engine didn't start, I would then test to see which of those two was the problem. The next thing I'm going to do is get to the CARB and remove it for an inspection. So here's the foam air filter I was talking about. It's already a bit saturated with old fuel and oil, otherwise it's in pretty good condition. I'll have to remember to clean it before I put it back on. So the only fuel line that's still connected is the line on top of the CARB. I do believe this line connects to the back of the purge bulb on the shorter port, which it is. Now the longer port should then have a fuel line that's supposed to go back to the tank, and it looks like part of that line is still there. The other opening on the fuel tank is supposed to be for the fuel filter. Now this line is supposed to go through any one of several openings through the plastic housing and connect to the port on the bottom of the CARB. Now the routing of the lines isn't tough, but it can be very confusing to someone who's never done it before. Once the CARB is off the engine, we can get a better look at it. Now the interesting thing about it is that it only has one fuel adjusting screw, which makes it harder to fine tune, but it makes it a lot simpler to adjust. Out of curiosity, I'm going to remove the muffler so I can inspect the piston ring for damage, and while it's off, I'm going to inspect the spark arrestor screen as well. Now once I've rotated the engine so the rings are in view, we can see that the engine has 2 rings, which is something you don't see in low-end trimmers nowadays. Now the rings do not seem to be stuck, and there doesn't seem to be any gouging on them, so this engine is in pretty decent shape. Now the spark arrestor screen is meant to keep sparks from leaving the muffler and causing a fire. Now if this screen is clogged up from carbon buildup, it could reduce the power from the engine, but as you can see, ours is all clear, so I'm going to reinstall it. Now if yours is clogged, you could use a torch to remove the carbon or some carb cleaner and a wire brush. I would resist the urge to remove the screen because I wouldn't want to be the cause of a fire. The next thing I'm going to do is remove the spark plug and inspect it for carbon buildup and its overall condition. I'm also not a big fan of this aftermarket spark plug. I would always suggest to anyone when replacing their plug, always install what came from the factory. So it's a bit dark in color and somewhat wet from fuel, but then again, it could be from how much I sprayed into the air filter. Overall, it's in decent shape, and I'm going to reuse it again. So if I don't care for this brand of plug, why don't I just replace it? Well, it seems to be working just fine, and I would only change it if I was having a starting or running issue, and since we haven't gotten this engine running yet, I'm going to wait till then to decide if I want to replace it. The next thing I'm going to do is take the CARB apart to make sure it's in working condition. The first thing I noticed is that the inlet screen is not clogged with debris, which is great news, but we also want to make sure that fuel will pass through it, but we'll do that right after we look at the pumping diaphragm. So what we're looking for on the pumping diaphragm is that the two check valve flaps are not bent away from the rest of the diaphragm. The easiest way to do that is to look at it from the side. Now these look to be parallel with the rest of the diaphragm, so we can reuse it. Now if yours are bent away, then I would just consider buying a new CARB because it's about the same price as the rebuilt kit. Next we're going to check the metering diaphragm. So here's the metering diaphragm, and the good news is that it's still very flexible, which is what we want. However, there are a few wrinkles in it which could affect the way it works and affect the way how fuel is delivered to the engine. I don't want to go through all this effort, and since we're here, I'll just replace it. Now there's a lot of oil under it, which means this trimmer had fuel in the tank when it was put away. Now remember to remove the gasket from the old diaphragm and also take note of how long the stem is in the middle of it. That way when you order a new one, you'll get the right one. The stem can either be long or short, and this one happens to be the longer one. The next thing I'm going to do is see if fuel will flow through the screen. Once there's some fuel on the screen, just press the rocker arm on the other side of the CARB and hopefully it disappears through the screen. And unfortunately, it looks like fuel is not disappearing through it, which means we need to remove the needle and rocker arm assembly so we can clean the screen with some CARB cleaner. Just be very careful when doing this part because these parts are very easy to lose, with the spring being the one I seem to have a problem with. Now if you do lose one of these parts, save yourself from a headache and just replace the CARB. Now once they're gone, we can now safely clean the screen with some CARB cleaner. You'll know that it's clean when you see the cleaner disappear through the screen. Now do this as many times as you feel like, but ours seems to be working like it should. I'll then spray the rest of the CARB down and do the same test again with fuel on the screen. After putting some fuel on the screen, unlike the last time, this time it's passing through it, which is exactly what we want it to do. That means we can finally start reassembling the CARB with a new metering diaphragm. If you need one of these for your machine, please check below the video in the description for a link. Once the needle and rocker arm are back in the CARB, press on the rocker arm to make sure it's returning back into position like it should. If it doesn't, you'll need to remove it and reinstall it again till you get it right. Now when you're installing the new diaphragm, make sure you put the gasket on first, followed by the metering diaphragm. If you don't want to go through all this hassle of cleaning and disassembling, there's nothing wrong with just buying a new replacement CARB. I'm going to do something that I don't normally do, which is to find out where the adjustment screw is set at. That way we have something to compare to when we tune the CARB at the end of this video. To do that, I'm going to use a special CARB tool to turn the adjustment screw clockwise until it stops. Then we'll know where it was set at. After that, I'll turn it back to where we found it. So it looks like it took 2 1/8 of a turn before the screw stopped. I'll then turn it back that many turns and then start working on the fuel lines. Now unfortunately, after looking at the fuel tank, it looks as though the only thing in there is the plastic splice that we use to keep the return line from falling out of the tank, but the fuel filter is completely gone, which means we'll need to replace it. Unfortunately, this fuel filter cannot be replaced by just any filter. It needs to be very short and have a long, narrow nipple. I don't know why, but I had a very hard time finding the exact one I wanted, so I had to compromise a little bit. So this purge bulb is extremely discolored, and even though it's not broken, when it gets to this point, it could break at any time, so it's a very wise choice to just replace it. I ordered a kit that had new fuel lines, 2 fuel filters, and a new purge bulb. There's just one problem. The fuel lines are sized at 3/16 of an inch, which is the right size when compared to the opening on the fuel tank, but there's one big issue. To install the filter, its nipple and the fuel line have to pass through the fuel tank. Now if I put the fuel filter in the hole just as a demonstration, there's only a small clearance for the fuel line to fit between the nipple and the opening. Now if I put the new fuel line on the nipple, you can see just how much wider the fuel line expands, and I hate to say it, but it's almost impossible for it to fit in the tank's opening. So as a compromise, I'm going to use a smaller fuel line because the walls of this line is much thinner, so it should fit better without forcing it. The first thing I'm going to do is pass the smaller line into the hole through the bottom and out through the gas cap opening. I'll then install the filter and finally pull the line and filter back into the tank. As you can see, with the fuel line installed, it's nowhere near as wide as when we had the larger line installed. I'm not going to bother measuring it to compare them, but the real test is when we push the filter into the hole in the tank and see how it feels. Now we need it to be a little tight, so if it passes through with little effort, I'll have to come up with a different idea. When I can't pull the fuel line anymore, you can see that the filter is standing up against the hole in the tank. The next thing I'm going to do is press down on it while gently pulling on the fuel line so the nipple goes all the way through the tank. As you can see, here's the bottom of the nipple on the filter, which means the filter is fully seated, and I'm happy to say I still had to use quite a bit of effort to push the filter into place, so I'm sure there's a good seal between the tank and the fuel line. Next, I'm going to pass the line through one of the openings in the plastic and cut it to length. The next thing I'm going to do is use the same method for the return line, except this time I have to cut the line at an angle to help get it into the opening in the tank. I'll then cut off that angle piece to install the plastic splice and then pull the line until it stops. The only difference is there's no need for this piece to pass through the tank like the filter. Once the fuel lines have been installed in the tank, it should look something like this when you get finished. Now, if you thought that was the end of the craziness, well, we haven't ran the new fuel lines yet. The next thing we need to do is cut the return line so it stops where the purge bulb goes. Then what's left of that line we just cut will start at the purge bulb and pass through the plastic housing to be installed on top of the CARB. The return line will then connect to the purge bulb's longer nipple, and the other line that goes to the top of the CARB, the end near the purge bulb, will then connect to this shorter nipple. If it seems a little confusing, don't worry, we'll go over it once again once the lines have been ran, and it should make a little bit more sense. Once the lines have been installed to the bulb, we can now install it to its base. Now there's a notch on one side of the base, and that means it can only go in one way, so you might have to rotate the bulb to get it to seat. Now don't force it, otherwise you might break something. So here's how my fuel lines are ran. The filter line is the smaller one, and it comes down and passes through the housing and ends where the bottom of the CARB will be. Now this line goes to the top of the CARB and passes through the housing and connects to the shorter port on the bulb. And finally the return line connects to the longer port on the bulb and goes back to the tank. Now that pretty much ends the craziness on this trimmer, and it's a pretty simple job after that. Now at this point, all we need to do is reconnect the fuel lines to the CARB, followed by the throttle cable, and then the choke plate. But before we go any further, I'm going to put some fuel into the tank and prime the fuel system. The reason is that if there's a problem, I can easily fix it now, versus if we get everything back on it. So when priming the fuel system, fuel should come through the smaller line and into the CARB. It will then leave the CARB through this line and into the purge bulb. It will then partially fill the bulb and then make its way back to the tank through the return line. As you can see, it's flowing through the lines just like it's supposed to. Now, if your fuel isn't flowing like this, then check your lines again, and you might have some in the wrong location. With the cover off the engine, it also allows me to see if the CARB is leaking, which it's not. However, if yours is, there might be a problem with the CARB, and I would consider replacing it. Before I start this engine, I'm going to make sure there's plenty of line out of the trimmer head, because this actually puts a load on the engine, and if we end up making some adjustments to the CARB, I want to make sure the line is out as if we're using it. Now, I was having some trouble getting any line out of the head, and I had to take it apart, only to find out that somebody had tied a knot inside the spool. I don't want to mess with it right now, so I'm just going to move some of the line out and deal with it later on. Unfortunately, it stopped running while at half choke. I'll try that again to see if it does the same thing or if it improves any. So it stopped again, and at the same point it did last time. Since this engine is dying before turning off the choke, I do believe this engine wants more fuel to stay running. For this particular CARB, I need to use the single D CARB tool to be able to turn the adjustment screw, but yours might need a different tool. If you want a set of these tools, please look in the description for a link. Now, to give this engine more fuel, I'm going to turn the fuel adjustment screw counterclockwise a quarter turn, restart the engine, and hopefully it stays running this time. I don't know why the engine just died while adjusting the idle speed, but we'll figure that out soon enough. Now, to deal with the engine bogging while squeezing the throttle, I need to turn the adjustment screw another quarter turn in the same direction as before. Now that I have the CARB set to where it runs good, I'm going to see where the adjustment screw ended up at. We'll then compare that setting to where we first started at. Now at the beginning, I had to turn the screw a quarter turn counterclockwise twice from its original setting of 2 1/8 of a turn just to get it to run, which means we started adjusting the CARB at more than 2.5 turns. But after getting it to run well at full throttle, we find that the CARB is now set at only 2 turns. That means I had to set the CARB to deliver a lot of fuel to the engine initially, but as it got more run time, the CARB must have cleared itself, which then required me to reduce the amount of fuel being delivered. Now, the most likely reason for this is that I didn't use an ultrasonic cleaner, nor do I even bother trying to clear the tiny passages in the CARB. The reason for the first part is I don't have an ultrasonic cleaner, and there's a very good chance you don't have one either. If you do have one, fantastic. But a lot of people watching aren't going to go out and get one, so that's how I show it being done. And so what about a deep clean on the CARB? Well, you need to remove the adjustment screws, jets, and Welsh plugs, which is something most people aren't going to do, and as you can see, it's really not necessary. Once the CARB gets some fuel moving through it, it'll clean itself out. So what happens if it doesn't clean itself out? In that case, I would then ask you to just buy a replacement CARB and not have to deal with the headache of cleaning and reassembling a CARB again. So another option as to why this CARB's final settings are so far away from its initial start settings is that as the engine got more runtime, the inner workings started to clear itself up from the old residual oil in the crankcase, or the spark plug started to burn off whatever was covering it. Basically, the engine was knocking off the cobwebs. So my question is, would you have done a deep clean on the CARB like I described, or even go out and buy an ultrasonic cleaner so you don't have to worry about making such crazy CARB adjustments? Or would you have done what I did and just let the CARB clear itself out? I don't think I have to tell you which one I would choose. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.